And now we're going to look at a for loop in C. For loops in C are actually quite different than for loops in MATLAB, but they have the same underlying principle. They're still going to focus on using a loop control variable to help us count the iterations of a loop. It's just that we're not going to provide a vector from which we draw the values of our loop control variable. We're going to control it using three different parts of our loop control statement. So here's an example of a for loop right here, and here's the what the loop statement looks like. You'll see that there are three parts, all of which use our loop control variable I. Of course, because this is C, we need to declare our variables before we can use them, so we can see that I is actually declared up here before we get to our loop. Now we can look at what the different parts of this loop are. The first part is the initial value that's assigned to I. When I'm going through my code and I get to the loop, I will be assigned 1 before the first iteration of the loop. The next part of the loop is a condition, and this condition is again checked before each iteration of the loop. So when I get to the loop, I'll assign 1 to be the initial value of I, then I'll immediately check whether or not the condition is true. If the condition is true, I'll come in and I'll do an iteration of my loop. Okay, and then this last part here is called the increment, and this happens at the end of each iteration of the loop, and it's how I update my loop control variable. I++ here is a shorthand for I equals I plus 1, so this will add 1 to I. So the way that this loop works is I'll start my program, I'll initialize my variables sum, num, and I. I'll get to the loop, I'll set I equal to 1, I'll check my condition. If the condition is true, here it would be because 1 is less than num. I'll do an iteration of my loop, then I'll increment my loop control variable, so now I would be 2. I'll check the condition again, 2 is less than num, I do an iteration, increment I, now it is 3, check is 3 less than num, do an iteration, and so on, until this condition becomes false, then I'll exit my loop. So even though it's a little bit more complicated, we have to declare our loop control variable and then provide all three parts here, the initialization, the condition, and the increment. We're still essentially doing the same thing using a loop control variable to help us count our iterations. Just a couple of syntax things to notice. There's one set of parentheses that contains all three parts here. They're separated by semicolons, so we have the initialization, a semicolon, the condition, a semicolon, and then the increment with no semicolon at the end. And the body of the loop is again enclosed inside curly braces.